Earlier today, or at least I don't know when the interview took place, but it was published earlier today in the New York Times, Vice President J.D. Vance gave an interview to the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. They talked about a lot of things, the new Pope, Catholicism. I always think J.D. Vance is a very smart and interesting figure. And we'll see that even more, I think, once he is no longer the vice president, but will presumably run for president on his own, and then he's not as bound by the Trump administration and their policies to say things. Obviously, no vice president can come out and contradict the president. It's really not the job to do that, but still, he does speak openly and often expresses ideas in a very coherent way. And he said something today with Ross Douthat about these court rulings, including from the Supreme Court, that I think is very notable because it's a very tendentious argument, if not a false argument, about how our American founding, how the system of government was created. J.D. Vance went to Yale Law School. He understands the law extremely well. So let's just take a look at this part of the conversation.
Okay. Let me just make one final sort of philosophical point here. Mm-hmm. You know, I worry that unless the Supreme Court steps in here, or unless the district courts exercise a little bit more discretion, we're running into a real conflict between two important principles in the United States. You know, principle one, of course, is that courts interpret the law. I think principle two is that the American people decide how they're governed, right? That's the fundamental small d democratic principle that's at the heart of the American project. I think that you are seeing, and I know this is inflammatory, but I think you are seeing an effort by the courts to quite literally overturn the will of the American people. And to be clear, it's not most courts, but I think what the Supreme Court has to do, and I saw an interview with Chief Justice Roberts recently where he said,
its job is to obviously decide cases, but in the course of that, check the excesses of Congress or of the executive, and that does require a degree of independence.
Yeah, the role of the court is to check the excesses of the executive. I thought that was a profoundly wrong sentiment. That's one half of his job. The other half of his job is to check the excesses of his own branch. And you cannot have a country where the American people keep on electing immigration enforcement, and the courts tell the American people they're not allowed to have what they voted for. And that's where we are right now. We're going to keep working it through the immigration court process, through the Supreme Court as much as possible. And look, success to me is not so much a number, though obviously I'd love to see the gross majority of the illegal immigrants who came in under Biden deported. That actually is a secondary metric of success. Success to me is that we have established a set of rules and principles that the courts are comfortable with, and that we have the infrastructure to do that allows us to deport large numbers of illegal aliens when large numbers of illegal aliens come into the country. That to me is real success. But I think whether we're able to get there is a function, of course, of our efforts, but also of the courts themselves.
All right, so like I said, that's a very well thought through, cogent argument. You understand the points he's making. As usual, he's very articulate. But I still want to make a few quick points before I get to the primary point that I think is crucial to note about what he said. So first of all, I agree with his premise that the American people have made abundantly clear that they want mass deportation of people who have entered the country illegally. Whether they differentiate between people who committed crimes or committed violence, or whether they want really all 11 million people or however many it is who entered the country illegally in the last few years deported, let's assume that a majority does actually want that. They've expressed that in polls. Obviously, Donald Trump ran on that as one of his defining principal goals in 2016, 2020, and 2024, and he was elected twice by the American people, understanding that was one of his goals. So let's concede that a majority of people actually want the Trump administration to remove everybody who's in the United States illegally. Now, he also said the Supreme Court is at some point going to have to step in. Now, as I said, the Supreme Court has stepped in twice. And by 9-0 rulings, they ruled against what the Trump administration was doing, saying that it violated the Constitution. There was one time that the Trump administration, in the middle of the night, deported 237 people, all Venezuelans, to El Salvador to go into prison for life with no hearing, no ability of those people to say, I'm not in a drug gang. And the Supreme Court ruled by 9-0 that you cannot remove people under the Alien Enemies Act without first giving them the right of habeas corpus to at least say, like, hey, they got this wrong. This tattoo that they have interpreted as my being in a drug gang is actually something else. And there were several people who pretty clearly were not part of drug gangs who were removed by that, and that's because they were given no evidentiary hearing. And of course, governments are going to make mistakes when they accuse people of things unless they get a hearing. That's why habeas corpus exists. So the Supreme Court has twice ruled against them, also in the Abrigo Garcia case, 9-0. The other issue is that, and this is really important to get, and I think so many people have become misled and deceived on this point, confused by it on purpose. We have a system of laws that permit the administration to deport people who are in the United States without legal authorization. It is not a long, protracted process. In fact, you don't even get to an Article III court, which is like a real court, a federal court. All you can do, if the government says, we know you're here illegally and we want to remove you, deport you, the only thing you're entitled to is you get a quick hearing inside the Homeland Security Department. It's not a court in the judiciary, it's a court in the executive branch, a deportation court that basically rubber stamps what the Homeland Security wants to do, what ICE wants to do. And the only question in the hearing is not, are they criminals? Did they do something bad? The only question is, are you here in the United States without legal authorization? We claim you are, and then it's up to the person to show that they have legal authorization. If they can't, they're deported. It's quick, it's easy, it's cheap. It's how President Obama, for example, deported millions of people. So we have a system that the Supreme Court has no interest in messing in, the judiciary has no interest in messing in, hasn't demonstrated in any way an attempt to impede that. The entire reason there's a controversy here with courts, and the entire reason why these courts have been deeply concerned, is because the Trump administration decided, for multiple reasons, that they didn't only want to use standard deportation law. They wanted to give themselves way more power than that to invoke what is called the Alien Enemies Act, which is a law passed in 1798 that says in wartime, the president has basically unlimited authority to do whatever he wants with people who are alien enemies, people who are not American citizens, but who are enemies of the country, because basically they're siding with their original government with war and not with the United States, or they're here to subvert or undermine the United States as war fighting. And because it's such a draconian statute, because it gives the president so much power, it's only been invoked 3 times in American history when there were real wars taking place: the War of 1812, World War I, World War II. And this is the law that FDR used to order all Japanese Americans in detention camps pending the end of the war, which is considered one of the worst civil liberties disgraces of the 20th century. So it's only his invocation of the law and all the immense power that that gives that has caused the courts to even be concerned in the first place. Does he really have the right to invoke the Alien Enemies Act under the statute? Are we really at war in the way the statute intends? And then the second question, which the Supreme Court already answered by 9-0, is even during wartime under the Alien Enemies Act, for example, when they wanted to put Nazi sympathizers in camps or to deport them, even they got hearings so they could disprove the accusations against them. So what the Trump administration is doing is not deporting people back to their country of origin, or they could just use standard deportation law and there'd be no problem. What they want to do is do things like put them in Guantanamo, send them to horrific dungeons in El Salvador and pay the El Salvadoran government to keep them in prison basically for life. They're talking about sending them to South Sudan or Libya. These are way outside normal deportation proceedings, and that's why they wanted to invoke this very extreme law. So anyone who tells you, oh, the Supreme Court is saying you have to give 20 million people a trial before you... No, totally false. Totally false. If you're deporting people under standard immigration law, it's quick and easy through the Homeland Security once ICE arrests them and they're out. And the only issue is, are they here illegally? But when you invoke the Alien Enemies Act, there are major constitutional questions involved. And that's why courts have stepped in. So this idea that, oh, the American people told us to deport and the courts are preventing us from deporting, no, they're not. They're preventing you from invoking the Alien Enemies Act, or at least doing so in some cases at all because we're not at war, or in some cases saying that the people you want to accuse of being members of a drug gang or a violent gang at least have the right to contest the charges against them, much like they ruled that Guantanamo detainees have the right to habeas corpus. You can't just call them terrorists and put them in prison forever, even if they're non-citizens. They have the right under our Constitution, because the rights of the Constitution are for anybody under the control of the United States government, not just citizens, to go into court with a habeas case and disprove the accusations against them. And of course, many people in Guantanamo, once they got that right in 2008 in the Supreme Court ruling, went into court and disproved the accusations against them, proved their innocence, and they were let out. Because if you give government the power to punish people with no trial, there's going to be all kinds of mistakes, all kinds of malice, and huge numbers of innocent people are going to end up being punished. And a founding principle of our government, as we showed you before, Thomas Jefferson said it, Benjamin Franklin said it, it comes from Blackstone, the British legal theorist who became the foundation of Anglo-American law, said it's better to allow 10 guilty people to go free than it is to punish a single innocent person. That punishing a single innocent person is such a grave crime, such a grave injustice. You take away their liberty, you throw them in a prison somewhere, even though they've done nothing wrong, that the evil of that is infinitely better than even allowing 10 guilty people to go free. Benjamin Franklin, probably one of the top 3 most important founders of the United States, actually said it's better to let 100 guilty people go free than to punish one innocent person. And the Bill of Rights does that. The Bill of Rights places all kinds of barriers in the government's way when they want to pick up a suspected criminal, when they want to convict them. There's massive barriers that they have to overcome. They can't enter people's houses without a warrant. People have the right against self-incrimination. They just can refuse to answer questions. They have a right to the jury of their peers, to a lawyer. On and on and on. Things that make it difficult for the government to convict guilty people. Due process, because that's a principle, a founding principle of our country, is that you don't punish people who you haven't proven have committed crimes. Again, if it's just a question of are they in the country illegally, you just deport them under normal deportation law, but you're not sending them to some foreign country or to be in a prison. You can only do that under the Alien Enemies Act by claiming, oh no, these are alien enemies and that's why they deserve to go to prison. So those are all important things to take of note, but I want to make this part extremely clear. It's so important. It's so foundational to our system. And J.D. Vance knows this and is kind of playing with the fact, exploiting the fact that most people don't understand it because it's not intuitive. You have to either study the law or have read about the Constitution or know the concept of law, but he's basically saying the minute a majority of Americans want a policy, they want mass deportation, they're in favor of this, they're in favor of that, court shouldn't intervene. He's saying we have a democracy. A democracy means that when the majority of people want something, they get it. That's what we are. We're a democracy, and that means when the majority decides something, the courts can't intervene and tell them they can't have it. This is exactly the opposite of how our country was structured. Just go look at any of the Bill of Rights. Let's take the First Amendment. That guarantees freedom of religion. What does that mean? Even if, let's say 93% of Americans, almost all of them, favor criminalizing Christianity or criminalize the practice of Judaism or Islam, no matter how much support you get for it, the government still can't do it. The Bill of Rights is an imposition on what the majority wants. Let's say the huge majority favors banning certain speech. We want to criminalize racist speech. And polls show 93% of the people want that. Politicians who promise to criminalize racist speech keep getting elected. Clearly the majority of Americans favor it. Doesn't matter. Because the Bill of Rights says we don't care how much support you have for limiting speech. Congress still shall make no law limiting speech. The Constitution is there to put limits on what majorities want. That's why the United States isn't a pure democracy. It's a constitutional republic. If we were a pure democracy, J.D. Vance would be right. Just let the majority decide everything. Have referendum on everything. Let the majority decide everything. Whatever the majority wants, they get. But the founders were elitists. They were petrified of majoritarian rule, of majoritarian passion, of majoritarian mobs, of majoritarian factions. These were all wealthy landowners. One of the things they were petrified of is that majorities of people would rise up who were poor and didn't have land and vote to nationalize their land or take away land from the landowners and just distribute it. And that's why they put limitations on that you can't deprive people of their property without due process of law. You can't take away, the government can't seize their property without just compensation. So much of this was a fear of what majorities would do. J.D. Vance knows that. And it's not just J.D. Vance who knows that, but our system has always operated that way. Do you know how many times conservatives have run into court to ask district court judges and then appellate court judges in the Supreme Court to nullify a president's policy, even when it's incredibly popular, on the grounds that it's unconstitutional? So the Republican Party always says, yeah, this might be popular, you still can't do it. The Constitution prohibits it. So many examples. Here's one from NBC News, September of 2022. 6 Republican-led states sued Joe Biden's administration over his student loan forgiveness plan. So Joe Biden wanted to cancel student debt. He ran on a promise to do that. He got elected. Polls show majorities favor that. And yet Republicans still went into court and said, no matter how popular this is, you still can't do it. Quote, the states, Nebraska, Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, and South Carolina jointly filed a 36-page complaint in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri, the second legal challenge this week against President Biden's debt cancellation plan. Their lawsuit echoes some of the arguments made in a complaint filed Tuesday in Indiana by a lawyer who works for a conservative-leaning firm. Attorneys general or solicitors general formed the 6 states argued in the suit that the president's plan violates the separation of powers and a law that dictates how federal agencies can craft regulations. They also predicted that it will financially harm them, saying, for example, that the mass debt cancellation would cost those state tax revenues. Quote, in addition to being economically unwise and downright unfair, the Biden administration's mass debt cancellation is yet another example, they said, of a long line of unlawful regulatory actions. Quote, no statute permits President Biden to unilaterally relieve millions of individuals from their obligation to pay loans they voluntarily assume. Now, if I were J.D. Vance, I would say, what right do courts have, once the majority of Americans make clear what they want, what their view is, to come in and tell the American people they can't have it? The American people voted for the politicians, the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, Barack Obama. Obama never promised it, but many members of Congress, that they would cancel all or part of student loan debt, that it was, we don't want a country where only wealthy people can go to college and the people who aren't wealthy end up leaving school with massive debt that burdens them for life. And so conservatives repeatedly sued over Joe Biden's attempt to try and cancel those loans, even though, there you see another one, conservative group sued to block Biden plan, canceling $39 billion in student loans. We can go to the next one. In Newsweek from 2023, Joe Biden's student loan forgiveness fight gets a boost before the SCOTUS ruling. And go back, we can say what the article is saying is that, look, the conservatives are trying to have courts nullify Joe Biden's student loan policy, even though he promised to do it when he ran and won. And even though it's popular. Quote, a new poll by Redfield and Wilson Strategies conducted on behalf of Newsweek found that 62% of Americans support the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness plan. The same percentage said they backed the plan in a poll conducted in March, indicating widespread support for the plan has remained steady in recent months. Support was highest among younger Americans, the polls found. More than 2/3, 67%, of those aged 18 to 24 said they support the plan, as well as 76% of those aged 25 to 34. So you have widespread support among various demographic groups. You have overwhelming support in the citizenry for Joe Biden's loan forgiveness plan. He ran on a promise to do it, and Americans elected him. It's exactly the argument that J.D. Vance is making about mass deportation. And it's true, in both of those cases, the American people wanted it. Nonetheless, the Republicans said, courts, you need to step in and do this no matter how popular it is because it's violating the Constitution. Exactly what courts are doing now with the way in which the Trump administration is trying to engineer mass deportation through the Alien Enemies Act. J.D. Vance knows it is not a principle of the American Republic that majorities get whatever they want. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.